My name is Catherine Adcock-Admey, and I'm a visiting professor in public policy at Duke University. Good morning. I have the great pleasure this morning, on behalf of the Living History program at Duke University, to be hosting a panel in which we will be interviewing Justice Yvonne Mokgoro of the South African Constitutional Court. We are very fortunate to have Justice Mokgoro here with us for a spring residency at the Franklin Humanities Institute as our visiting distinguished scholar. Our interview with Justice Mokgoro will be with my colleagues Ebrahim Moosa, Associate Professor of Islamic Studies in the Religion Department and also Associate Director of the Duke Islamic Studies Center, and Diane Nelson, Associate Professor in Cultural Anthropology. We will be conducting this interview largely along topical lines, beginning biographically and then moving to 5 subcategories of ideas that have been very important to the development and the contributions that Justice Mokgoro has made, both as a professor and now as a justice. We'll ask Diane to begin.
Thank you again for being here with us. It's very exciting. So I'm very glad. I'm sure you're aware of that old Shakespeare line about lawyers. First thing, let's kill all the lawyers. But of course, some of the most important figures of the 20th century in terms of people's liberation struggles, including, of course, Mahatma Gandhi, Fidel Castro, Oliver Tambo, and Nelson Mandela were lawyers. Would you like to comment? Sort of on the rule of the law, the role of the law, the sort of tension there between lawyers as something to be gotten rid of, and yet some of these very important people, including yourself, choosing law as the place you want to work.
If I look at myself and my understanding of the law as it operates in South Africa today, I think I am happy that we have lawyers in our society. If you might know that in the South African context, legal education has always been highly formalistic. As I was saying yesterday when I had some intersections with an audience, that in South African history, the idea of justice was measured by the accuracy of the law itself. And it didn't matter what the impact of the law was on society. If Parliament had passed law, it was justice. And, I can actually imagine how difficult it must have been for judges to operate in that situation. But I think lawyers in South Africa have really taken it in their stride to transform from that system and idea of justice to the system of justice which is based in our Constitution, where justice is about transforming society into a society based on the atrociousness of apartheid to a society based in justice which takes into account the impact of the law on society. And to be, in the leadership of a system and a transformative idea of law such as that is, I think, taking from myself a great pleasure to operate as a lawyer today. And I think lawyers have an important role in South Africa to lead in the understanding of the law, to lead in the demystification of the law and of our democracy and of our transformative society. I think lawyers have a great role to play. But I must hasten to say, I don't think law operates in isolation. And for that reason, lawyers have to work hand in hand with all other people in our society to bring about the proper understanding of our democracy, to popularize our democracy, to popularize justice as it is based in the Constitution. So you have a huge role to play as a lawyer in South Africa.
Yeah. Yvonne, can we ask you now, from that abstraction of what lawyers do to your own entry into the law? You tell us a beautiful story about how somebody once said, let's start with you. Can you tell us and everyone watching this interview today how it came to be that you followed in the footsteps of Nelson Mandela?
Before the practice of law was even an idea in my mind, although I always knew that I will work with people one day, when I become, as I wanted to be a professional, as it was my ambition. I had thought I would become a teacher which is usually, you know, the cold face of working with people, I met a wonderful man, Robert Sobukwe, just perchance, who was a practicing lawyer in my community in Kimberley, one of only two pardon, practicing lawyers. And I had an encounter with the law as an ordinary person, as an ordinary member of society, where instinctively I had stood up for a young man who was being arrested for no apparent reason. And little knowing that I had placed myself in a very invidious position, standing up against apartheid police. And of course, they dealt with me the way apartheid police dealt with you. They arrested me, and I got charged for obstructing the ends of justice, which was obviously spurious. And I was so fortunate to have this man, Robert Sobukwe, who had then recently been released after a 10-year jail term on Robben Island, and he had been banished to my hometown, Kimberley. And as I say, at that point, he was practicing as a lawyer because he studied law while he was on Robben Island. And he defended me, and he got me discharged from this spurious charge. And as we were walking together, we struck this conversation, and I was lamenting the paucity of young men in my hometown, you know, studying law. And I thought it would be wonderful if we have more people like you, I said to him, young men who go to university to study law, so that we can have people like you, you know, to practice law in the city and to defend people in the way, you know, you did with me. And he just looked at me and said, why men? You know, at that point in time, you hardly, you know, had women as lawyers, particularly as practicing lawyers, particularly within black communities. And he actually encouraged and motivated me to study law. So I went to university, I actually registered for a legal degree, and the rest is history.
For our readers, for our viewers rather, can you say a little bit about who Robert Sobukwe was in South African history?
Robert Sobukwe was the leader of the Pan-Africanist Congress, which is one of the leading liberation organizations then in South Africa. Now it has transformed into a political party, of course. And he had been jailed on Robben Island as a political prisoner. And generally what the South African regime would do was, when people are released from Robben Island after they had served their jail term, they would be banished to remote areas and expected to now intersect with remote communities where they are not known, so as to minimize the influence, particularly political influence, that they might have on communities. But it didn't always work out that way. Robert Sobukwe, for example, was highly influential in my society. He was highly respected, and he was a source and a resource of huge political influence. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit, to paint a picture for those of us thinking about this remote part of the country to which Sobukwe was banned, that you lived in, Galeshwe Township? When you tell your grandchildren now about your life as a young girl growing up in Galeshwe Township, what do you tell them about to help them understand how different the post-1994 South Africa is from the one in 1950 that you grew up in?
It was different in the sense that it was hugely difficult. We grew up in a township, almost no, resources that would enkindle the human spirit, And usually when we sit in court and we deal with the impact that apartheid has had on black people, and we look at the unequal and unjust distribution of state resources, which would normally, assist in empowering communities, and the lack thereof in townships, I always get reminded of my own upbringing. But we had schools and we had generous people. I, for example, went to a mission school. Hugely generous people who came all the way to South Africa, to assist in providing what government usually deliberately kept away from black people. And we cherished, the opportunities that we had. And I think, a parental guidance during our time was also important. Although we lacked the amenities that other racial groups in South Africa so easily had and took for granted, we had family togetherness. We had family encouragement. We had family support. We had family love, amidst this or deprivation sometimes, material deprivation. And I always laugh about it when I say to people, it's so funny that while you grow up in the township, because you don't have much to compare with, the idea that what you don't know, you don't miss, but at some stage you grow up, at some stage you interact with other communities, and suddenly you realize that something is horribly wrong here. And that's the case with most township kids, We had, the idea that we were all in it together, we were connected with each other, the general warmth that you get from neighbors, from members of community, the role modeling that you have in your teachers, in your religious leaders, and the morality of togetherness, which we today explain in the idea of Ubuntu, that you grow up with, that you connect with each other, and so that when you move out of that society and you begin to relate to other societies and you begin to compare, the warmth and the strength of the human spirit built in the morality of your own society makes you a person who can stand up, to what you come across. So that is how we grew up in the townships, Role modeling, most people wanted to become teachers, we wanted to become religious leaders, wanted to become doctors, because those are the people that they see, as they grow up. And you had people like Robert Sobukwe who would actually encourage you and make you understand that despite, material shortcomings, the spirit in you, you have it in you. That's what he actually told me. You have it in you. You could stand up against the might of the police, stand up for this young man. It means you have it in you to do exactly what I am doing, speak on behalf of people.
Yeah. I know we've talked a little bit about some of your work doing sort of consciousness raising or political education. Could you talk a little bit about how you saw your own consciousness being raised, or sort of the moments for you personally when you sort of saw things or decided you had to do maybe even more than just train to be a lawyer?
I think my upbringing has a lot to do, of course, like everybody else, with your personality, As I say, we grew up in very materially deprived communities. I was one of 9 children. But I grew up as one of 8 because my sister passed away before I was born, my eldest sister. And that warmth of family love, of family care, sort of shaped your personality. And as it happens with generally families, where there is togetherness and warmth, there's always a level of responsibility placed on the elder siblings to look after the younger ones. So you grow up with this need to care for the more vulnerable. And you are actually questioned if you don't conduct yourself in that particular way, And I think that, in that family setup, simply goes with you when you begin to interact with broader communities. You have that consciousness that you have a responsibility towards the other who is not as strong as you, who is less vulnerable than you, because sometimes we're all vulnerable, but you look at those who are less vulnerable and you feel a kind of responsibility. You feel the need to envelope in the warmth even the other. And we went to mission schools, religious communities, and that was just taken further within a community setting. So that, you know, even during the struggle days when we were university students, struggling for the benefit of everybody. You don't struggle for your own, for yourself. It is about how we see communities, how we see black people, how we see South Africa as a community of South Africans benefit from our struggle. It's all about the interconnectedness between you and the people you interact with. And you give yourself, because you are in a better position than another, you know, to stand up, not only for yourself, but also for the other. And you move with that into broader and broader communities. And that it is that consciousness, I think, that shapes you as a person who would work not only for your own welfare, but for the welfare of those others who you interact with.
So did you become involved in a particular political movement?
Well, I was part of the student movement, the South African Students Organization, SASO, you know, which was known as the formation for student political activity at the time. I joined the ANC, the African National Congress, and I operated at regional level, and I was heading in my Northern Cape region Justice for Women. When I was an academic, we formed UDUSA, which was a national organization for university teachers of law, and through that medium too, we engaged in struggle for the betterment of education for our students and working conditions for ourselves. And in that homeland environment, we formed the first anti-repression forum, the Mafeking Anti-Repression Forum, where we, you know, confronted authorities head on for the oppression and repression in those local communities. And it was risky, but it was that, you know, a consciousness that you are in a more powerful position as a university academic, and there are people who are at the coalface of the impact of this oppression and repression. And if there's something that you can do, not only for yourself, but also for others, you're in a position to do that, you do it, despite the risks.
Now, I know that your husband lost his job just on suspicion that he might have been a political organizer, and that he was unable to find work again, leading you to have to leave, to move away. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, at the time, we had this, what South Africans are familiar with, Section 10A rights, which was a particular provision in the Group Areas Act, which permitted African people to operate, work in areas outside of their places of birth, whether it is in a rural area or it is another urban area of South Africa. And you could not work in an urban area if you didn't have permission, from the Minister of Home Affairs, I think, to have a job in that particular urban area. And we used to carry, mostly men, you know, used to carry passbooks which would be endorsed accordingly. If you have permission to work in that urban area, your passbook would be endorsed, so that if you come across police authority and they want to know if you have the permission to be in the area, they would read it from your passbook. Your passbook almost carried your history. Which happened with my husband, which affected my father, because he was working in Johannesburg and he didn't have permission to do that. He didn't even have a passbook, and he was arrested for not having a passbook, and he served some time in jail at the very place where the Constitutional Court is now today. And my husband was also a victim of that kind of legislation, and he was, the long and short of it is that he was deported, you know, outside, to leave Johannesburg within 72 hours. That's what they normally did. And because we are Tswana, we belong to the Setswana ethnic group, he was deported to the Tswana homeland, and that is how we landed in Mafeking, where we started this anti-repression forum. And both my husband and I eventually became academics, and we operated together in these formations.
I wonder if we could ask you, Yvonne, to tell us a little bit about what the new South Africa feels like to your parents. When you first showed up on campus, you told us this very moving story about how your father really knows what equality and human dignity and freedom means. Yeah. I wonder if you can tell us another story, either that one or the one your mother might tell, about how there really is a new South Africa, if they think so.
Yeah. My father passed away about 3 years ago, but I always remember, his response when we were once in a conversation and we were talking about the new South Africa and what the freedoms and what impact this newfound freedom has on us as people, as members of the community. And my father once said, if anybody would tell him that South Africa hasn't changed, he would say to that person, you need to have your head read. Because, based on those past law experiences, where if particularly you are a man and you come across and encounter police authority, the first thing you think about is to check whether you have your passbook on your person. Because if you don't have it on your person, even if you have one, if you don't have that identification document that tells your life story, you would certainly be arrested and spend at least a night in jail. So he was saying, if anybody tells him that South Africa hasn't changed, it would be so incorrect, because for once, after all of the suffering based in the context of the past laws, apartheid atrocities, now in this new South Africa, if you come across a police officer, you no longer have to pat yourself and try to find, if you have your passbook on your person. In fact, he used to say, if ever a police officer would ask me where your passbook is, he will tell him what to do with himself, And that is how he measured the newfound dignity in the freedom that you have as a human being, as a member of the South African society, to move freely around without being questioned. And to him, that was the basis of human dignity. Now he can walk around freely like everybody else, without being questioned. And he really cherished that. And I think, it is his experience as an ordinary working class person. That's where he starts measuring the newfound freedom in South Africa. You and I will look to other, aspects of our new freedom and equality and human dignity. I will say, now suddenly, I never thought I could be appointed as a justice of the highest court in the land. And here I am. But my father, as an ordinary working class man who used to suffer under the passbook laws, measures his newfound dignity in the freedom that he exercises, just the freedom to move around.
If your father, the index of freedom was the absence of a passbook, I remember the index of a freedom for me is to walk freely on the beach.
Oh, absolutely.
How was it for your mother? How did your mother understand?
My mother has always been a domestic. My mother has been the kind of person who thought she was there to provide the motherly love, the motherly warmth, the motherly guidance. And I think for my mother, just to see her children thrive, I think for my mother, that's what freedom is. My mother was always worried that she's got bright, problem-free children, who listen. And she always felt that, like my father used to say, one generation ought to make really sure that the next generation has a quality of life so much better than the previous generation. And my mother she provided the warmth in the family. If she needed to, she would assist my father in making him bring an income through her domestic experiences. And you can just imagine being a domestic worker in the apartheid system, where equality was not even a thought, where the treatment of domestic workers was almost, at the level of slavery. And my mother had to put herself through that all the time. And now she doesn't have to do that. She doesn't have to do that. And her children operate at a level sometimes even better than her former masters. For my mother, she just relishes in the progress that her children are making, the education that her children have attained, despite, the levels of poverty that we have experienced. And she prides herself in the idea that although we didn't have much, that could go around, and they tried their best to get us an education, we have in fact, made use of that guidance, made use of the warmth of love that they provided us. And despite, sometimes the lack of resources, in our family, the little that we had to share, they have given us sufficient guidance, to make useful members of society out of us. For my mother, that is what freedom means. And the fact that whether we like it or not, we're able to provide her with the material benefits that they never could provide us with.
It's an amazing story. It's an amazing story.
Actually, do you want to go ahead and ask the rock question?
Oh, well, actually, we have a little bit more time for this section. Okay. So I think I have a couple of questions, and one that goes back to some of what you were saying about how does one even imagine oneself into the law, or that is a sort of place where one might work or sort of create these kinds of changes. And thinking specifically sort of how the sort of situation in apartheid South Africa resonates with current day, where the ANC, under the law, was called a terrorist organization, a subversive organization, one in which in some ways dehumanized anyone who was even suspected of being a member, so that the law or the police, as you said, are someone you stand up to, someone you hide from, someone you lie to when they come to your door asking, where is your brother? And you might know that he's outside the country working for the ANC, but of course you lie to the law. And what a sort of difficult transition that must be both for your imaginary, but also for everyday people, to think of the law as a place that could be welcoming, that could serve them. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about sort of that transition in the very idea of the law as something that what is about humanizing and empowering, and not about dehumanizing and harming.
I think as a lawyer, for me it was quite easy. I've always had the understanding that law operates among people, and law must therefore take into account its impact on people. When we are at law school and we study law the first year, we're told that the definition of law goes like this. It is a set of rules which regulate human beings. It's the kind of thing that Professor Moosa was talking about yesterday. Law has always been seen as a medium to manage people. And that is really not the case. And I've always had that consciousness, as I was studying law, of course. And if you look at my areas of research, it has always been African jurisprudence and the contribution of Africans themselves to the development of the jurisprudence that is part of the law of their country, the need to do that kind of thing. And I engaged in those studies during apartheid. If you look at my master's degree research, it was about law and development. I've always seen law as a medium of transformation, a medium of people's lives. But in the South African setup generally, law was what the lawmakers wanted it to be. And of course, throughout the struggle against apartheid, communities have never really had real respect for the law because they saw it as a tool of oppression. And it is for those communities that it becomes difficult to transcend, and move into an idea that law is there to take into account their interests, to do justice for them, based in this just transformative document that is our Constitution. The courts as institutions of transformation, so to say, legal jurisprudential transformation. It's difficult at that level to make that transition. And it is for that reason that people like us, who are conscious of the real role of the law, generally and particularly in this new constitutional dispensation, I think have a huge role to play to take our people along. And it is not enough sometimes, I think, to sit there as a justice of the Constitutional Court and create this new jurisprudence and create legal principles which bear on the lives of people. Sometimes I think our responsibility goes even beyond, outside of the courtroom itself, because we have the information, we have the understanding, we have the consciousness, to translate the justice that is based in the Constitution, translated into the lives of people, at least by disseminating that information. And in the process also becoming conscious, of the needs of people, of the challenges in society, and taking that consciousness and basing the further development of constitutional principles on the needs, the aspirations of people. To my mind, a justice of the Constitutional Court has a role beyond just the courtroom. A justice from any court, for that matter, professionals in South Africa. We should never just confine ourselves to sitting on pedestals and pontificating about the Constitution. We have a role to go into communities, and interact with communities and transmit that consciousness in the consciousness of our people.
I think this is something we might talk about a little bit later, but the whole sort of creation of the building of the court and the work that the justices were involved in, not just in going out, but in making a place where people might come into. But maybe we'll leave that for a little bit later. One more question on this. I remember when we were doing work in solidarity with the anti-apartheid struggle that there was a saying that was on many posters. It was on a poster in my first apartment, which said, "You have touched the women, now you have struck a rock." So this was a rallying cry for many of us in the United States trying to sort of help from here that struggle there. And we realized that that was very much about the apartheid and sort of this place where you cannot move the women. But we also know that when the ANC came to power and the various projects to try to create a more just system, they also hit the women and struck a rock, especially in some of the debates about how sort of customary law and was going to relate to some of the sort of the passions for equality and justice in the Constitution. And we know that you were very involved with some of those struggles through a feminist understanding. Could you maybe say a little bit about that?
I think that came with the territory, in the sense that, this new dispensation didn't have a clean break with what existed before it. It was a dispensation which had to operate in the context of the values that existed among our people. And it was difficult for the people around the negotiations table to continue to recognize and even strengthen African values based in, existing African systems, and at the same time negotiate for a dispensation which would create South Africa as a just society. so that the position of women under customary law was a pertinent issue, you know, during the negotiations. And it was important too at the time. I remember, you know, that people had felt that their systems, African systems, have always been undermined by successive colonial regimes. You know, apartheid was probably the strongest. And with a new dispensation, it is time now that Africans take their rightful place, not only within South Africa, but join with existing systems throughout the continent, throughout the diaspora. And Africans now have the opportunity to hold, South African Africans have their, black people have an opportunity to hold their heads high. And instead of digging the graves for their value systems, for their traditional systems, it is now time to get them to emerge, you know, and take their rightful place. But that was difficult. It was difficult because the position of women in those systems was precarious. And women had now emerged in a way that they felt the need to assert themselves. They were part of the new dispensation. And at the same time, they recognized the need for respect. Respect of existing African value systems. But somewhere we had to meet. Somewhere there would be a crossroads. And at that crossroads, the women understood that if you strike a woman, you strike a rock. Because they needed to stand up for themselves. And that's exactly what they did during the negotiations, you know. With the first round of negotiations, we recognized the need for women to come together and play the role that they should play in order to strengthen the position of women. With the first CODESA, you know, CODESA 1, it was quite obvious that women had been left behind, because in that conference space, you could count the women on your one hand. So when those talks broke down, at the time when Chris Hani had been assassinated and the talks had been suspended, women came together and mobilized. Mobilized around the need to strengthen their presence around that conference table, so that when the next round of negotiations came, women were there in their numbers, they were there in their consciousness, they were there in recognizing the need to strengthen the position of women in South Africa. And they played their role, they played their rightful role. What emerged, represented in the Constitution, is certainly an effort that women, you know, realize that they need to make for themselves, but also for South Africa. Because I always say, you know, the development of a society, you may even say the civilization of a society, is reflected in the development of its women. And if the women lag behind, as far as I'm concerned, the society lags behind.
So during these negotiations, Yvonne, this is right before, this is in the transition period from the old dispensation to the new dispensation. It's a critical transitional moment. Can you tell us, what were you doing, where were you, and how did you help those women take the stage?
I was an academic and I was teaching at the University of the Western Cape. Professor Moosa is familiar with the area and with the strength of the University of the Western Cape and the role that it played through its faculty in the transition, not even before the transition, during the negotiations. We were academics and we were liaising constantly with the women around the negotiations table now. I'm thinking of people like Frini Janwala, I'm thinking of people like Bridget Mabandla, and Frini Janwala, who was the first speaker of the Parliament of the Democratic South Africa. Bridget Mabandla, who later became Minister of Justice. Yeah, those were some of the colleagues with whom we interacted. We as academics, particularly through the center of the community center at the University of the West, Community Law Center at the University of the Western Cape. So we would liaise with those women, you know, debate the issues that were current around the conference table. As academics, assist with the formulation of provisions which they would propose, you know, around the conference table, and they would report back, you know, what happened during plenary, so that we had this constant interaction with women on the ground and women around the conference table. At certain intervals, there were workshops, there were seminars among women where we formulated issues which gave women a presence in the constitutional dispensation, in the Constitution itself. So those are the contributions that we made as women in the academy, and together with these women in the political area, we would go down and conduct workshops with women, you know, in the townships, Khayelitsha, and the University of the Western Cape was a vibrant forum for these intersections between women and ordinary people on the ground, and the women who had a place around the conference table during the negotiations. It was a wonderful experience, totally wonderful.
That's quite extraordinary, that how academia, community, and negotiators played that role through the Community Law Center. So we had a number of people who brought together. It's very rare that you find that live connection. It made the whole intellectual enterprise very organic. I think one of the outcomes was also the way in which the women's lobby, for lack of a better word, created and put pressure that a certain number of parliamentary representation would have to be filled by women, right?
Yeah. I mean, I always had this idea with my research, my LLM research, law and development research, and the need for an African jurisprudence research. I had this idea that societies have to be an integral part of the systems that are created, because systems should not be created for people, they should be created with people. And it was important for us, you know, to get down there and know what women, particularly those women in rural communities, in urban townships, who were subject to traditional laws and traditional systems. It was important to know what their views are and how they see, you know, themselves emerging, you know, in this new dispensation. And for us as academics to reformulate, you know, their aspirations, and for the politicians to take them forward and actually create new political systems out of those. It was very important to do that.
We are now going to move into a series of subcategories of topics, and you've beautifully helped us to start the thread. In fact, a couple of our topics we've already touched on in this biographical section, but we wanted to move from this sort of biographical launching point now into a topic on plural legal systems. So we have customary law, religious law, and constitutionalism that in the next half hour we're going to be asking you questions. And so we wanted to start this segment just as you ended with people in the rural areas, people in the townships are subject to customary law. Can you tell us what part of customary law you were subject to?
Well, I grew up in a township. I grew up in a family where traditional customary law almost had no real role to play, because we don't have experience of rural upbringing. Customary law operated in the township setting because people came with you know, the lifestyles from the rural setting to the urban areas. I was born in an urban area. I was born in a family where customary law as a system of law really never had a role to play. It was my experiences with the experience of other people, and to see how customary law operated in their setting, that, you know, created the consciousness in me that there's a role that I, as a South African woman, can play in easing the burden for women who are subjected to customary law. But I grew up in a traditional family setup where the man was seen as the head of the family, where the woman was seen as the one who provides guidance to the children and is in the forefront of raising the children. So that patriarchal setup was there. You know, it was there in almost every South African family. It was even there, I know, among white South African families, Afrikaner, English, all of them, black people generally. When I started to interact with my mother's bosses, you know, I used to go to my mother's workplace every day after school. I would do my homework and then walk to my mother's workplace to assist my mother with her baby, because she always went, you know, when she was working as a domestic, went to work with her baby, and at some stage would need some relief so that she can complete her chores. And I was the one who had been assigned this role, would have to walk to my mom's workplace. And I interacted with white families and realized that, you know, this pattern is universal. But it was not a system which was necessarily oppressive. You know, it was not seen as oppressive. It was the differential roles that men and women would play within family, and became almost, you know, normal. But as you grew up and you realized sometimes how that same system could act in a way to hold women back, then the consciousness increased. But the idea of an African marriage was also alive in African families, you know, despite their urban setting. The idea of creating a connectedness between two families when a couple get married through the giving of lobolo was part and parcel of even urbanized African families. I mean,
Explain what lobolo is for folks.
Lobolo can never really be explained accurately, you know, with Western systems. Perhaps the nearest, most accurate Western term would be bride price. And in this case, the family of the groom would offer cattle as bride price, which symbolized the coming together of two families. And two families meant extended families on both sides. And once lobolo is given, it was a symbol of the marriage, and therefore where marriage means the bringing together of two families as opposed to two people meeting as husband and wife. Yeah. So that symbolism was part of even urban lifestyles, you know.
And even your
My lifestyle, even my marriage, you know, was based in the coming together of two families through the giving of lobolo, and the urban equivalent of giving cattle would be, as people say, giving walking cattle or giving money cattle. So you measured the number of cattle with the monetary amount, which was the case in my situation, where my husband gave money as a symbol of the bringing together of two families. So he gave lobola in monetary terms, as opposed to what people would do in rural areas, giving cattle as the symbol of the coming together of two families.
I understand that, in fact, he didn't have to pay up immediately, that this was a symbolic kind of ceremony.
Absolutely. I mean, the idea of lobola is not so much the commodity itself that gets, you know, given. It is just the acknowledgement that two families are coming together, and through the coming together of these two people, you have a whole extended family now created. So that in real terms, lobola needn't be given in physical terms, as long as there's an agreement that it will be given at some stage. There is an understanding that it will be forthcoming, and there is a point where the two families come together. that is sufficient, particularly in a setup where there's lack of resources, as it was in my case. You know, my husband didn't have to give lobola immediately when we got married. He gave it much later because he felt the obligation to do that. It was not necessary at that point because the two families had already become integrated with you know, one another. But he did it as you know, an obligation that is usually placed on young men to ensure that their families actually do that. And sometimes the young men would go out and work and accumulate property so that they assist their families, you know, with the giving of this commodity as symbol of the coming together of two families. So my husband gave it much, much, much later, you know, but he felt good that he had at last done it. So he says, I thought it was not necessary to do it. We've gone so much along way, 35 years of marriage. It was an obligation, it was a duty, you know.
It's probably nice for young men now to know that the husband of a constitutional court justice was able to do it 35 years into their marriage, that they don't have to work before they can marry the woman of their dreams.
Yeah, there are criticisms around the idea of lobola, but for now it works. It brings families together, you know, and it creates obligations on people. And sometimes you cherish what you have because you are connected.
I think we might get into this a little more when Ebrahim asks questions about religious law, but for people who sort of grew up only under a constitutional law system, could you sort of explain what is often entailed under the idea of customary law? I think that's quite an unusual way of thinking for many people in the U.S. So family issues, there wouldn't actually be a law on the books saying you have to give lobola, but it was something that would be expected in a community.
I think it is a lifestyle, it is a tradition, social lifestyle, which is sufficiently forceful, you know, and in terms of which people conduct their lives. It's a system, it's a value system, it's an all-embracing outlook on life, you know, a practice, a social system based on your outlook of life. And Ubuntu is very central, really, to the idea of African tradition, and based on the idea of communal lifestyles and communalism, you know, where there is total interaction between the individual and the broader society within the individual operates, whether it's a family, whether it's a small community, whether it's a society, and that idea can be transposed into you and your connection with your country, you know. But it is an African system which is age-old, which has always been operating among Africans, in terms of which people conduct their lives, you know.
But it's a little more organized, right, than simply how you go about your life. I mean, if there were a problem with the lobola, you know, if the...
Yeah, it's a value system.
Would there be someone you go to? It's not just in the family?
It's a social system, which has been used, unfortunately, by the apartheid regime to actually oppress people, you know, because they turned it into a legal system and recognized aspects of the traditional system which created some kind of, you know, which made it possible for the apartheid regime to achieve control.
Indirect
you know,
rule.
Indirect rule, control over African communities. And what they generally did was to use the traditional leaders to subject them to their colonial systems and create an obligation of with them to achieve, to make it possible to subdue, you know, African societies, African communities. And to a certain extent, you do find resentment, you know, towards the system as a system of law. You know, because it had throughout apartheid been used to subdue black people. And it is those aspects of the African customary law, and we call it law because it was created, it was turned into a law. It is those aspects of African customary law which we think need to be trumped by, you know, a new human rights dispensation. But there are areas of African tradition that people cherish. You know, the connectedness with the individual to family, the responsibility to family that you have, the obligations that are created, you know, with the older siblings to look after the younger, and the obligation created on fathers to take responsibility for their children. You know, very difficult sometimes in an urban setting where, you know, a capitalist lifestyle has individualized lifestyles in such a way that that communal system suffers breakdown around the fringes, and it's very difficult in a capitalist society to maintain that communalism. But the fact that these social systems, value systems, you know, a set of social systems and value systems, it is at that level that families continue to build, you know, on even during these capitalist, individualistic, imposed systems of law or systems of value systems. But there's a constant tension sometimes between, you know, that traditional setting, that traditional system, and the new, more individualized systems of law, for example. Yeah, and it is at that level that we think, you know, if we continue to build on these African, valuable African notions and African traditions, we can integrate them with new dispensations. You know, instead of creating tensions, we try to reinforce. We try to allow them to reinforce each other to the extent that it is possible and necessary.
Yeah, I wanted to explore that point about this intersection and the ability to begin to integrate that. I know that aspects of customary law has been subject to Law Reform Commission, etc. Can you say a little bit more about how you see that? Because there is some recognition of African customary law, and from time to time there's been kind of debates about its place or the tensions it generates. But you have an interesting formula for that, of how to begin to let it also seep into the kind of the dominant system, particularly the aspect of communal, the communitarian aspects, etc. How do you envisage that?
You know, I think the first step is for us to acknowledge the fact that African lifestyles have moved on. We no longer live in the perfectly communal setting that our foremothers and forefathers have. But we also need to acknowledge that there are aspects of African value systems that have survived. And it is at that level that we need to find an integrated system which strengthens those cherished values in African value systems, and the new dispensation which has taken Africans, even Africans along, you know, where women have moved away from traditional systems and have become, you know, sometimes stronger members of their own communities, where women have a role that they play now that is no longer the subdued, you know, backbench role that women play, that women are now heading families, that women now are becoming part of society and part of the leadership of society, so that those communities and those people who can still conduct their lives in terms of those communal settings may do so, but can be strengthened by the new dispensation. And we must recognize that the choice needs to be given to women. There are women who still want to live in those settings, who do, but who are sufficiently strengthened so that those rural lifestyles and African traditional lifestyles can no longer operate to oppress women or to subdue women. You know.
Could you talk a little bit about the case in which the question of an inheritance of a chiefdom, of a leadership role was supposed to only go through men, but then there was a whole question of could a woman actually inherit a chiefdom?
In fact, that's a perfect example of the need to cherish traditional values if they work for society, but to interlink and interpose them with the newfound values which give women the strength to take leadership roles, for example. Traditionally, kingship, or what the colonialists called chieftainship, has always been vested in male persons. Whereas traditionally we do have systems where women were leading members of traditional societies. They were queens. And in later life, when women had to take a background position, they were regarded as guiding and role models within society. So that even in those settings where in African tradition there was communal life, where marriage was also polygamous, the authority of the first wife was always cherished. And the guidance of the first wife, even to her husband, was always cherished. And that broke down, with the urban development and individualized systems of values which started to integrate with African lifestyles. But having said that, we have now moved into a situation where, despite the value that we placed on our traditional systems, there's recognition that traditional systems are as dynamic as the people themselves, and they have to develop in terms of their dynamism. We're now operating in a dispensation where equality between men and women is a basic principle of our constitution, and therefore a basic principle and basic value in our society. So how do you marry the fact that African traditions are led by men, and then you have a new dispensation where the equality of the woman is part of the new value system? You have to integrate the two. It is possible, therefore, for women to take leadership positions equally, side by side with men. And the idea that we preserve and reserve inheritance of traditional leadership status to men need to be changed.
Well, isn't that
If
the
women,
of that case?
absolutely,
Yvonne?
if women are able to take leadership positions because they have the strength to do this, even within the traditional setting, women can become leaders. And that is what that Shilubana case is all about. Yeah. In that case, a woman who was a parliamentarian, for that matter, reflecting, the level of dynamism that society has experienced, so that the princess of the royal family, the princess in the royal family, was a member of parliament. But at the time when her dad died and the kingship was up for inheritance, she was still too young to take over. She was still at school, and her uncle, who is normally in those settings seen as merely a regent, the one who holds the position until the one who inherits is old enough to inherit. But unfortunately, she was the eldest, and usually the kingship is inherited by the eldest sibling. And the eldest sibling in this setting was a girl. And in terms of African tradition, she could not inherit because she was a girl. The next one in line, if a boy, would have been the one to inherit. But at that point in time, there was nobody to inherit, and the uncle took over. So the uncle was, strictly speaking, just holding the kingship. But then, African settings being what they are, and the whole distorted idea of vesting traditional authority in men only, got things to develop in such a way that when this man now passed away, his son inherited the position, which means that the kingship has now shifted from the family of the original king to the family of the uncle, simply because there was no man to inherit in the original family, and with the next family, where the uncle really was just a holding king, his son inherited. But the community were conscious that the kingship belonged to this family and not to that family. And they were also conscious of the workings of the new dispensation. They were conscious of the fact that in our day and era, it is possible for women to take leadership positions, even within a traditional setting. And it was challenged. The idea that the kinship has now to shift to the uncle's family simply because the woman is up for inheritance there was challenged. The matter eventually came to the Constitutional Court, and the Constitutional confirmed the views of the community, that this kingship really belongs to this family, and if the eldest in this family is a woman, we live in a dispensation where there's equality between men and women, and maybe communities are now ready to be led by women. We've shown it in other areas, it is going to be shown in this area, and she was actually enthroned not so long ago.
So there it's exactly where you see the
Coming
sort of
together of two
understanding
systems.
changing.
Absolutely.
We have actually a beautiful image of this, and that we'll talk about when we come back to
Yes.
the relationship between art and justice in that
Yeah.
court. But there is a beautiful image of the family, the community, the Limpopo community,
Absolutely.
Valoy community coming to hear you pronounce on this. Do we need to move to religion at this point?
Can I ask just one more question about customary law? I think we're okay for time, given when we started. These issues about sort of how to decolonize relations within a community that have been permeated and saturated by colonial power, by counterinsurgency, by these attempts by the powerful to sort of take what's most powerful in a small community and kind of turn it against them, are very powerful throughout Latin America as well as in Africa. And I've been thinking a lot about this for Guatemala as they come out of a period of war and are also trying to sort of create a new constitution and a new way of living. And a lot of struggles about what that's going to mean and what customary law will be. And gender is a huge issue there, where many Mayan men, sort of Mayan indigenous men, I think sort of acquiesced in a certain way to set what some people have called the patriarchal colonial contract, in which you get some, you give in to sort of the whites who came in to take over your country, but you were given absolute power over the women in your community. So they're like, okay, we'll give up a little as long as we get to keep this. So they also move into a place looking for more equality and a more just way of living. Many Mayan men will now say, feminism is a Western construct. Women's rights comes from outside. If Mayan women are asking for these things, then they are part of the colonial project. Whereas Mayan women are saying, no, the whole idea of patriarchy is not part of our, community historically. You are the ones who are duped by colonialism. But it's very much a struggle over who's going to control that idea of the authentic and the traditional, that it actually seems very similar to the struggles going on in South Africa.
Oh, absolutely. The patriarchal resistance was quite alive, and is still alive in South Africa today. It is just the need for us to intersect with each other and, get a common understanding and grow this common understanding without unduly, undermining either systems. But I think we do have an understanding in South Africa, despite the resistance that we might experience in certain quarters, that we have moved to an era in our lives where societies in South Africa have to build on the strength of leadership that we have in South Africa today, despite our traditional cultural systems. There's resistance. It is not easy. It has not been easy, for the women particularly, to emerge, in this new dispensation as a respected force that would have a role to play in developing its own society. We have remnants of that resistance still in South Africa, and time and again it rears its head, and when it rears its head, we talk about it. Professor Moosa just spoke about the transformative role that the South African Law Commission plays. A number of times it had to confront head-on some of these systems and suggest developments which would not unduly undermine the systems themselves, but reflect the need for South Africa to move on, to create more workable systems, because some of those traditional systems do not have a formidable role to play in South Africa today. What can be preserved is preserved, but I think we have an understanding that when we need to move on, we need to move on. And the Law Commission plays an important role in researching those systems and making proposals to the people of South Africa, because we see the work that we do at the Law Commission as serving the people of South Africa, gathering information, which we then present to the people of South Africa among prominent leaders. For example, if you look at some of the proposals that have been made around the need to reform to the extent that the Constitution requires, Islamic marriages. That has become a pertinent issue among Islamic communities. But the Law Commission has recognized that it cannot go forward without, a role to give to those communities for they themselves, to take part in creating a system which they believe would sufficiently serve Islamic communities without undermining the basic systems that operate in those settings. Yeah.
Which is segueing directly into
Which goes right into my next
Oh,
question.
okay.
Yvonne, so as chairperson of the South African Law Reform Commission, you've been intimately involved in the research and the work that's been going on in the Muslim Marriages Act. And now this piece of proposal and the research and all the developments around us has been now for 6 years. Since 2003 the report came out, etc. It seems that there are some kind of internal problems there on the question of gender and women's rights issues, etc. How do you think this will go forward, or how do you see the issue being resolved?
I hope the issue can be resolved between members of the Islamic community and now the legislature, because the project has now moved outside of the Law Commission. We gathered the information, we brought communities together to look at the proposed marriage system which will emerge, and we assisted with conducting workshops and seminars. In other words, creating fora for Muslim communities who had, differential views about what the current Islamic marriage should look like and should be. We just led that forum. We have come up as the Law Commission with a proposed Islamic marriage bill, and once we present the Minister of Justice, or the Minister who administers the law with the bill, the role of the Law Commission ends there. Okay. We struggled, I must admit, for almost 5 years. Almost 5 years to get to a stage where we have a bill. And I think that is because of the consciousness of the Commission and the efforts that the Commission made to bring together people who were not like-minded about what a new Islamic marriage recognized under South African law should be or should look like. It was necessary to do that because people have different views, and if we thought if we can get people with different views together Some resisted, the influence that the Constitution will have on Islam, the traditional Islamic marriage. Others welcomed, the influence that the Constitution will have regarding gender equality, so far as Islamic law generally and the Islamic marriage would be concerned. And it was necessary for us to bring these people together so that they themselves get an agreement as to the type of marriage that they would want to see operate in their communities. Unfortunately, it was very difficult because most of the time they agreed to disagree. But we couldn't have, we still needed a law. And we were fortunate to get one of our Muslim colleagues, a Muslim judge, to head that that forum, because he was heading the chairperson of the project committee, Judge Muhammad Nafsa, and he struggled. We at long last had to get a bill, and the opportunity for those who are in disagreement with the proposed bill is still there, because the bill is now before the portfolio committee, it is now before the legislature, before parliament. It is no longer our project. We have done our work, and parliament is now interacting with Muslim communities to finally get this bill into law. To what extent they will do that, to what extent they have changed that bill, in order to get consensus, I have no idea, because it is now a parliamentary process. It would be interesting to know to what extent that proposed marriage bill has moved from what the Commission presented Parliament with.
It seems that the parallels between the struggles in the Muslim community and also the parallels in terms of customary law are fairly similar. Because there are people who believe that the law is dynamic and can move on, and others who believe it should remain in some kind of pure zone. In many countries, and South Africa is a kind of a pluralistic society in terms of the legal regimes. You have the dominant legal regime, but you have customary law, you have Islamic law, the possibility of Islamic law. Do you see this as a kind of a useful way of negotiating and dealing with different moral and value systems? Because some scholars think that there's value to such an approach, because when you have such an ambitious and innovative way to go to the future, then one thing is to reduce injustice between groups, but also enhance justice within groups. And it seems that in African customary law or in Islamic law, there's been this attempt to enhance justice within the groups, etc. Even though other people might say, but you're creating a differential year for African customary law, for people who follow the secular law, for people, you're creating certain kind of differentials. But within those groups, they are being empowered, they are being enhanced, and they're being enabled to go in a different direction.
I think people's values in societies which are constituted by a diversity of people need to be cherished. If we create new universal systems, I believe that they should not be created at the expense of people's values. So that if we have a system where we all come together and agree that this is a system which will universally give us an opportunity to participate in, if we can preserve our own value systems, which are integral to our lives, and we create this new universal system without undermining those values, but also do it in a way that those values will not be seen as systems to oppress people. So there needs to be a come together at a universal level, without undermining that which is still valuable and cherished by communities, And that is exactly what's happening in South Africa. We have our universal legal system, but we continue to recognize the individualized community systems. But it is important to know that because we create a universal system where all are equal, even those communities who have their individualized systems should find that this universal system doesn't trample on their dignity, in the sense that it forces them to continuously and continually have systems which oppress members of those societies. We must have an agreement that at some level we will create systems which will trump on the injustices that might be operating at our individualized levels. I think, Desmond Tutu's Rainbow Nation, of South Africa, is a perfectly workable system, on condition that we are equals at universal level and we remain equals even at our individualized levels.
Justice Mokgoro, you keep calling us professor, so now I think, despite your having said, call me Yvonne, I think I'm going to have to go back to, unless you'll do the same for us, equality. We're going to conclude this section about plural legal systems by coming back to the point of constitutionalism. And I'd like you to speak a bit to the question, the doubts raised about constitutionalism itself. Some people, during the time of the Constitution, worried about a Bill of Rights as opposed to a Bill of Rights. And that conceptualization of the Constitution isn't just a figment of the past. There's some drumbeats of that kind of concern still. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that. When people say to you, this document, this Constitution, is just the ideas of fancy people who live in the Santon suburbs, it doesn't take into account poor people who live in Alex right across from the Santon suburbs. What do you say? Is this a Bill of Rights? What is it?
We couldn't avoid, getting some of those noises heard. There were skeptics around the idea of a Bill of Rights in South Africa, not only among those people who wanted to continue to operate at the top of an oppressive system, but even people who felt that, traditional communities who felt that a Bill of Rights is about individual rights. They hear a Bill of Rights, they already understand individualism and the probable breakdown of South African societies as a result of individual protection of individual selfishness, So that in traditional communities there was skepticism. There was skepticism generally around, communities who struggled, against apartheid, and there was a feeling, the general feeling that now our hands are cut off, now we cannot transform our society, now we cannot equalize things because we will have to comply with a Bill of Rights, and we cannot sufficiently transform our societies where the land, for example, has to go back to black people who have been dispossessed, through successive colonial regimes, and particularly apartheid. We can no longer correct because we have this idea and system of individual rights which will from now onwards dictate to us what we can do and cannot do. But if you look at our Constitution and you look at the fact that not only do we have protected rights in the Bill of Rights, but we also have values, basic values of human dignity, the value of equality, the value of freedom, which we hope will be interpreted in such a way that they become the fabric, not only of our law, our legal system, our jurisprudence, but will also, become part of the psyche of South African society, and therefore become the fabric of our society. A society based in the idea of human dignity, respecting the human dignity of another person, granting another person to the freedom to reach her or his potential. And that's what our Constitution says, Creating equality at all levels where you can, as a human being, become part of society in a society which cherishes your freedom, which cherish the idea that you are as equal as any other. You have dignity as much as any other. And those are not strange notions in any African setting. They're not strange notions. The whole idea of Ubuntu, you know, as a worldview of African societies, which operated throughout, you know, traditional African lives, and I think still is relevant in African societies today. The idea that the one member of society is interconnected with your society, the society in which you exist, you know, creating the interests of this one person as the interests of society and vice versa. And I think that is a kind of society that the Constitution is trying to create. Our Constitution, in the interim Constitution, reflected the need for South Africa to move from a society based on the atrocities of apartheid to a society based on justice. In other words, if you look at the values that are protected in our Constitution and the rights which are based on those values, the idea is certainly to create a caring society. A caring society which is a society based on the idea that I am responsible for you as a member of society. My society is responsible for me. We have that interconnectedness. We are creating a caring society based on Ubuntu.
Could you say something about a meeting that you had this week while you've been in residency with a living group here that has called itself the Ubuntu House? What is their idea of Ubuntu as you could discern it from talking to them? And really from your perspective, what is your idea? How different are these ideas? Give us a chance to hear again what your idea of Ubuntu is.
Well, this is a group of students who have come together and as a group call their group, you know, Ubuntu, and the place where they operate as Ubuntu House. And I think they pretty much are accurate, you know. The way they see what they are doing and the meaning of Ubuntu as we understand it, I think they are on the spot. Ubuntu is really a social value system which is based in the traditional African communal life, where members of society interact with each other at a level where they take responsibility for each other's welfare. So that there's always an obligation created in an individual to see herself or himself as part of a broader community where you not only benefit from being part of that community, but you also have responsibilities towards that community, and vice versa, so that each and every member of the community sees herself or himself as part of an integral whole, and then your interests are therefore interconnected, where you are interconnected with the kind of community. So you know, your interest becomes the interest of the community, and even members of the community see each other as interlinked to each other at interest level, at benefit level, so that you are because I am because you are. Without you, I cannot be. So it is that kind of relationship that is created through this social outlook on life. And what they are doing as a group of students, they come together and they play important role, you know, in doing things for communities, their communities outside in them, you know, outside of the campus itself. So they take up community development projects, and they contribute to the welfare and serve the interests, therefore, of communities who they see themselves as part of. In other words, they don't see their existence as students outside of the welfare of the communities around the university. And that's pretty much what Ubuntu is all about, you know. I am part of this community so that the welfare of this community translates into my welfare. I cannot thrive isolatedly from this community without ensuring that the community also benefits from the fact that I am a thriving human being. You know. So there's an interconnection between the students and the communities around the university, the Durham community, and that's what Ubuntu is all about. I was quite impressed.
In the South African context, I mean, Ubuntu, the term Ubuntu was part of the preamble of the 1993 Constitution. Somehow it fell out of the 1996 Constitution. How do you think the spirit of Ubuntu still pervades the work that you do and that your fellow judges do, etc.? I know it was invoked in one of the earlier cases on the death penalty, the idea of Ubuntu. But how do you talk about it both as a kind of as part of what you earlier said, to try and also transform judicial thinking and create a caring jurisprudence? How do you begin to see Ubuntu in that context?
There's a follow-up on that. Does it matter? Does it matter that the word Ubuntu is not in the 1996 Constitution?
Yeah. You know, because we saw the idea of Ubuntu as a fortifying factor, you know, in the Constitution, it would have been lovely to leave it there. Then it is there expressly and everybody can see it. You can constantly be reminded about the fact that what we as South Africans are creating is a caring society based on the idea of Ubuntu as I have outlined it just now. But you're quite right, your question is quite pertinent. Does it have to be there? By the time that we got the 1996 Constitution, which is the final Constitution, that which is now our Constitution, by the time we got that going, the Constitutional Court, for example, had already started to build a slight jurisprudence based on Ubuntu. So that we have that presence of Ubuntu and the idea of its strength in our jurisprudence, the idea of its strength in the thinking around constitutional issues in our society. We already had that in a little bit of jurisprudence that the Constitutional Court had started to create. And you might want to know that we've had later cases where the Constitutional Court continued, you know, to build on the idea of Ubuntu as it manifests itself in different settings with the different cases that we've had. We've used it as a fortifying factor in reasoning the decisions of the court when the death penalty was declared unconstitutional. We had it when the Constitutional Court articulated the value of restorative justice when it comes to matters of defamation in the Dikoko judgment. We've had it when the court made a decision around the challenge of communities in Matatiele, where Parliament didn't sufficiently take their views into account when it structured, you know, provincial borders and decided that the communities should fall under one province and not under the province that they had wanted to fall because they felt that that province sufficiently served their interest. We used it there in trying to show how important it is to make decisions and take into account the views of communities themselves because of the interconnectedness between communities and the authorities and the need for authorities to make decisions which take into account the views of communities. We've used it in 2 or more, you know, judgments as we articulated the reasoning of our judgments. And I think we will continue to do that. We didn't mention it, you know, in clear terms. We didn't label the articulation of the principles of Ubuntu in the Khoza judgment, you know, when we decided that foreign nationals who have become part of South African society, whose welfare and interest were integral to the interests of South Africans as indigent people who lived among indigent South Africans as permanent residents, and they have been in South Africa, since the 1980s, and they have become part of the permanent South African society, where the allocation of social security benefits aimed at alleviating poverty should not be, or should also be allocated to them. The fact that they are foreign nationals who are not South African citizens, but have become part of South African society, and they have, in their own minds, become part of South African society because they are permanent residents, makes them part of South Africa and makes them part of South African society. And if South Africa provides those indigent communities with resources to alleviate poverty, where they are also part of poor societies, there is no reason why they cannot be entitled to social security. Because if you leave those members of society within this broader society as poor members of society without strengthening, their plight by providing them with social security, the whole society becomes poorer. So everybody needs to be strengthened. You cannot isolate some members of society simply on the basis that they are not South African citizens. If you have poor members of society within your society, you have a poor society. And, those aspects of Ubuntu have become part of the jurisprudence of the court, and I'm happy to say that even the high courts have started, to follow that kind of reasoning whenever they articulate the values in our constitution. And the fact that we no longer have Ubuntu specifically mentioned, in the preamble of the 1996 constitution, as opposed to the way we had it in the interim constitution, shouldn't preclude us from articulating our jurisprudence and developing it along Ubuntu lines. If you look at a very important section of our constitution, which determines how public servants should treat the public, it is all based in the idea of Ubuntu. Treat people with dignity, because human dignity is integral to the idea of Ubuntu. Respect, human dignity, compassion, and accommodating other people, care for the more vulnerable. And if you look at the whole idea of the Batho Pele, we have in South Africa a policy based in Ubuntu, where public servants are required to provide those people who come, to access public services, have to be treated with respect, have to be treated with human dignity. If they lack information, have to be provided with the necessary information to strengthen their courage to require services, from the public service. And that is steeped in the idea of Ubuntu. So that Ubuntu doesn't necessarily have to be labeled as Ubuntu. If you follow the principles of Ubuntu, we will be strengthening our constitution and our society with these principles. Yeah.
This is very, very encouraging, Justice Mokgoro, to see that there's a Ubuntu jurisprudence emerging, and you saying that it's already developing. How do you see, and I think from everything that you said earlier, that the challenge in South Africa is to include indigenous values into what has been seen as a legal system that has over time has origins elsewhere. Roman Dutch law is one of the streams, etc., that informs South Africa. Common law is another stream that informs South African law, but also the African customary law, customary values, and other values to do so. So that makes what you said earlier, for instance, the question of equality, gender equality. So you have communitarianism or communal life with a kind of egalitarian streak within it, making it more egalitarian. How do you see the future of South Africa and Ubuntu in terms of the international economic systems, the global liberal systems, etc., that dominate, that pushes individual values, and on the other hand, the transformative possibilities in South Africa to create that happy mix, that happy blend between individual and communal values, etc. How do you see that? How do you see that playing out?
I don't see an impossible marriage
Okay.
between those systems. If capitalism can be used to empower people, that empowerment of individuals can be used to contribute to the thriving of your communities, the community in which you operate. And it is that value that we normally use when we look at wealthy members of society and require of them to contribute to the development of societies in which they operate. I think it is a marriage between the strength that individual, development can have to developing communities. If you have used the principles of capitalism to accumulate wealth for yourself, in a so-called individualistic way, there is no reason why we as members of society cannot require you to come back and operate in a communal setting and use your wealth to contribute to the development of your societies. It happens all the time in South Africa. It happens all the time. When we call on business, the business community, to make contributions to projects, development projects that operate among grassroots people, it is about using capitalism to strengthen the Ubuntuism in and among communities. A marriage between the two systems is perfectly possible, I think. We know that capitalism tends to encourage individualism without, going back to the communal idea of life. But if we constantly remind people that they have an obligation towards their societies, and we have nothing against them accumulating wealth for themselves, as long as they make contributions, then I think it's a perfect marriage between the two.
So Ubuntu must tame capitalism.
It
Ubuntu
must
capitalism.
absolutely. Capitalism might strengthen, the welfare of societies steeped in Ubuntu.
To kind of more push it in more welfareist directions.
Absolutely. I think it is possible.
So you actually have given a number of graduation speeches, which we have been fortunate enough to read, and I'm just going to quote one of them on the challenges of nation building. It picks up on something you said earlier about the need for the court to bring the people along, to build a political constituency, a cultural constituency for the ideas of the Constitution. And in a situation like the Xhosa case, where you're asking a country that is poor to share its resources with poorer people, you followed up on that case 4 years later in your speech, and you said, even though you are poor, out of a spirit of African unity, out of a spirit of Ubuntu, we need to live the ideals of this Constitution, live the obligations we've taken on under international law, and really share with people who are less fortunate than ourselves. Are you using Ubuntu as a way to help pull the people along, carry the people along, using their own values and showing how they're really paralleled in the Constitution?
Oh, absolutely. Interconnectedness is a basic strength of the idea of Ubuntu, where people, when they are interconnected and they share values, become one people. And once you have that interconnection, your interests, your welfare, those are also interconnected. And even if there is a scarcity of resources, your interconnectedness requires that you share even the little that you have. So that you cannot say, I have too little to share. You share the little that you have. And that is normally what occurs in the lifestyle of smaller communities. And there is no reason that you cannot take that principle, which operates at that small, community level, and create a principle which interconnect nations, which interconnect societies within on the African continent, where in a smaller setting, the interests of the more vulnerable must be met by the community. You look after the more vulnerable. You may all be vulnerable, but those who are more vulnerable have a bigger need to be looked after. And that is how it can operate among nations. That is how it can operate, on our continent in particular. Where people have melted the borders, particularly after 1994, when South Africa had brought apartheid to its knees. Borders were melted. There was interaction and intersection between communities. And if people have chosen, despite our difficult circumstances, to try and find solace for their own difficult, political, socio-economic circumstances, and they're coming to share the little that we have to the extent that we can, I think we need to recognize that we have a responsibility. We have a responsibility towards each other. We have a responsibility as the more fortunate ones to see to the welfare of the more vulnerable ones. And I see no reason that, the relationship between nations cannot encourage that idea, that outlook on life.
I think one of the hard parts is that, at least under what we often call neoliberal capitalism, the relation between nations has not been one of Ubuntu, right? And I know that there's been a lot of sort of questions about the kind of dividing of some of these very beautiful and idealistic understandings of Ubuntu and political justice from the actual relations and treaties and things that have been signed with banks and other financial institutions like the IMF that actually completely undermine on the economic level the ability to fulfill those things, not only as a desire to give what little you have, but that are really reinforcing sort of wealth differentials. The wealth differentials may not be as clearly racially coded as before. Now there is an African elite, now there are rich Black people, but that fundamental class difference hasn't been changed and has actually been made far worse. And I know that you've talked about this sort of great challenge facing South Africa now is the AIDS crisis, which of course it makes poverty more desperate, and it was made more desperate by poverty, and the criminality, the sort of sense that if I left my door open, I would be robbed immediately. So that's a reality that's maybe no more real than the ideals of Ubuntu that you've been putting up, as I think something everyone wants to work for. But how do we understand that sort of the desperation that leads to that criminality, and how that sort of is in tension, or more than tension, might really destroy the possibilities for Ubuntu that are being sort of put into practice through jurisprudence?
The threat of criminality is real. It is real among societies. And I do not think Ubuntu is about laying yourself open to threats to your life, You have a responsibility to protect yourself. But you also have a responsibility, if you have the means to protect yourself, to share that means to protect yourself. And even if it means that if you have the knowledge and the ability to protect yourself, you share it with the rest of your community. You therefore have a role to play in dealing with the criminality because you are part of the society. You cannot be seen to cut yourself away from society because society, you suffer under criminality created by society. You have a responsibility. Every time you have a responsibility towards your community, whether it is about assisting to create systems which are protective to everybody, when you yourself have that protection, you cannot isolate yourself. And that's the basic idea of Ubuntu. And if you take, the relationship between nations, where some nations tend to oppress others because they have the power to do so, it is so antithetical to Ubuntu, So if you take that basic principle and you get it to operate at that level, it is about interacting with other nations in a way that would strengthen those nations instead of you thriving on their weakness. Because the more you thrive on their weakness, it just brings the whole world down, you know, if you have to put it at that level. So that, you know, the whole idea of your welfare being the reflecting, you know, on the welfare that operates in society is an Ubuntu notion. And I think Ubuntu operates at various levels. It operates between two people. It operates between me and all of you as you're sitting here. It operates within communities. It operates within groups. It can operate with between nations. And, you know, sometimes it is a bit more difficult because of the complexity of the relationship. But if we find a niche for Ubuntu to operate and make things better for people, at every level, there's no reason why we cannot do that.
You talked about Ubuntu and international relations and the possibilities. And I was wondering if I could draw you out on, currently the United States has a president whose one father, whose parent was a Kenyan from Africa, etc. And the early signs we get from this president is talking about the United States is powerful, but there are other powerful people in the world. We have values, but there are other people have values elsewhere. Talking about a United States that plays a role as one amongst many, lowering its arrogance in many ways. People wouldn't put it in that way. What is your hope and your aspiration for President Obama?
A difficult question. But I think, you know, although we operate in our own systems, and we want to strengthen our systems as much as possible because we have an obligation towards our communities, we should see the world as a world community. And if we have the strength to make contributions towards strengthening world systems, then we even have an obligation to do that. I don't think the president of any country has an obligation only towards her or his people. I think because every nation has an obligation towards the world, the leaders of every nation have a responsibility, you know, to make contributions for the world to thrive. So that President Obama has a huge responsibility. Well, the United States is seen as probably, from a certain perspective, as a very strong, you know, a member of world communities. In the idea of the operation of the principle of Ubuntu, where the stronger have a responsibility towards the weaker, rather than expose its arrogance and oppressing the weaker nation with its arrogance. I think the United States has a huge responsibility towards the world, simply because it is seen as one of the strongest nations, if not the strongest nation in the world. There's a huge responsibility, not only on it as a country, but the leadership of the country has a responsibility towards the world. And if the United States has not up to now played that role, you know, sufficiently, it is time that it did.
So I think we need to conclude our section on Ubuntu and poverty and how these two connect. And I think what I'll do is to ask you, it's a sort of a follow-up on what Diane was asking you, which is there's this real problem between these beautiful values that are articulated in terms of freedom and dignity and the reality of most people's lives in Alex or Khayelitsha or Gully Shoi Township. And what are you going to say to the people who say, look, my experience doesn't have anything to do with this lovely animating principle? Can you bring these people along to show them that there's something in this Constitution that actually connects to them and their needs?
You know, surprisingly, it is actually those people from Alex and Khayelitsha who show us how valuable Ubuntu is, because those people conduct their lives in terms of Ubuntu. Those people may have nothing, but the nothing that they have, they share among themselves as communities. Those are probably some of the most cohesive communities that you can get in South Africa. People in Sandton, people in in Cape Town? Bishop's Court. Probably are less conversant with the idea of Ubuntu, you know. It is those communities where you have this cohesiveness and the strength that they have amongst themselves, probably also because they don't have much, you know, that goes around, that they are so cohesive. So that those people are probably more conversant with the idea of Ubuntu, you know, than most of us. And the need in our constitution to articulate the role that our constitution plays in creating caring societies would probably go down better among those communities than they would, you know, in other communities. But if you look at our constitution, you know, the values of our constitution and the rights that it protects, something very unique about South Africa's constitution is that it does not require, you know, these rights to be protected at principle level. Our constitution talks about substantive realization. The substantive realization of the protections in the constitution. In other words, it creates on the state and it creates on those role players who have an obligation to protect societies, an obligation to ensure that the protections of the Constitution are in fact realized. And we have a judicial system now which has the power to review the policies, the legislation, and projects and programs of government, so that if government programs and government projects do not in fact realize those rights that are protected in the Constitution, you can hold government to it. Now that's another reality which faces us. If government is not forthcoming, who will hold government to it? And again, we have a constitution which creates a strength, which strengthens communities themselves, individuals within communities who have the strength to confront government, to come to court and say to court, government is not living up to the aspirations of the constitution. We have those people in Khayelitsha who have no houses. We have those Grootboom people in the Western Cape who have no shelter. We have those mothers who are infected with the HIV virus, who are nursing babies and are facing the danger of transmitting the virus to their babies, and government is not forthcoming with antiretroviral treatment. Hold government to the obligations that they have towards our people. Our constitution strengthens those people and say you have the right to go to court and challenge government. And it says to the courts, you have the jurisdiction to order government to substantively meet the obligations that are created in the Constitution. And we've had that. We just need to strengthen that, to continue to articulate it, and continue to hold government as the ultimate provider in our communities, to continue to provide for people in terms of the obligations that they have, in terms of the obligations that we as a people have agreed with government that the government will have. We have a perfect setting. We have a framework. It is the action. You're quite right. We have a perfect framework. It is the action, but we need to be continuously vigilant and play our role and hold those who have responsibilities to the responsibilities that they have.
Just one more question before we move to talking about the transition and maybe comparing 1994 to the current moment. And I guess it would be around sort of the harder things to sort of deal with. One is, I know the work that you've been doing with rollback xenophobia. Or maybe just let's stay there. Sort of what led to the need for rollback xenophobia. People might not be aware of the riots and murders that happened recently, and also what is being done to try to roll it back.
You know, the Rollback Xenophobia project is a project of the South African Human Rights Commission. So it is a project that they themselves have initiated as a body in South Africa, an organ of state which has the responsibility of disseminating information about human rights and promoting the idea of human rights within South African community. So with the difficulties that we had to face with the oppression of foreign nationals by South African communities in South Africa, that was a project that they have always had, but which they strengthened during that time. So that it is an important role that the Human Rights Commission played, and they made use of people within South African community who were conscious, who had a constant consciousness about the need to discourage that type of behavior among South African societies, and they mobilized around that project and, so to say, disseminated the information and the responsibility that we as South Africans have towards fellow Africans on the continent, and the need to practice, the idea of Ubuntu amongst ourselves. So it is a project really of the South African Human Rights Commission, which became particularly alive during those attacks, of local communities, against foreign nationals.
I'm going to take the liberty of shifting our order around just a little bit. So we will speak for a period now about the representation of justice, broadly spoken, broadly thought about, but particularly looking at the building and the other kinds of ways that you speak about justice. And then if we have time, we'll get into the transformation questions, and finally an account of where you're going. So the question that was raised when Justice Albie Sachs was here about 2 months ago and spoke to our community about the relationship between art and justice. Is there a relationship, ? The place of art in rendering justice. We were taken into a building. We were shown all the ways in which this building is meant to be a place that feels comfortable, that feels like home, from the cowskins on the ground to the artwork embedded in the stairs, in the chandeliers and the doors. And the message that we were getting was, this is a place that everybody can feel their values, their personalities, their culture is reflected. I'm wondering if you have any sense, and it's not just the law in some abstract sense, it's us, the people, and our dignity and equality in this new dispensation as reflected in these small and very meaningful ways. I wonder if you have some sense of those people that are who were sitting in your courthouse, in your chamber, to hear you render the Shilobana decision, what they made of the Constitution from all the ways you tried to speak to them in the way you put together the building. Do you have a sense of what people think justice means because of this building? What they interpret justice as being now because of the work that you've done to translate it into ways beyond court decisions?
Courts have always been represented as authoritative systems. And they've always been seen as housed in imposing spaces. And people generally have always wanted to steer clear of courts because represent trouble, if not troublemaking. And among communities, there's always been the idea that if you are not seen around court spaces, you are a peace-loving person. But there was need for us to reverse that, because we're now operating in a system which is based on justice. And we're operating a constitutional court which is seen as the ultimate guardian of the justice in our Constitution. It was important for us to create a space of justice which would be identified as a protective space of justice instead of an imposing authoritative space which people wouldn't want to have anything to do with. We needed to create a space which will welcome people, which will actually encourage people to come, so that if they have those issues, as the Shilubana community had, pertinent to the survival of their communities, they should know that if that is being threatened, the Constitutional Court is an authority, so to speak, which is there to protect us. But you cannot hope to have that notion, disseminate among people if you don't create a welcoming space where people will readily want to go to the Constitutional Court. And those are, the issues which we, articulated when we gave the architects the brief, to come up with this building. You might know, Justice Sachs might have told you that the design of the court came about through an international architectural competition. And fortunately, we had a young architectural firm, South African young architectural firm, which won the competition, and they understood perfectly the brief that we had. And these are some of the values that we needed to reflect in the building itself, And just to see those communities come in the numbers, and which they did, and sit in court freely, in this, what I sometimes call piece of artwork, because that's what the court actually is. The whole court is just a beautiful, resonating piece of artwork where it has transparent walls which welcome people into its fold, with wooden floors, the warmth of wooden floors, which receives people with the warmth that reflects, Ubuntu in South African societies. And just to have those people come with the freedom with which they came. I mean, if you look at that picture, it reflects the freedom with which those people were sitting in that court, talking among themselves, standing around and freely addressing groups of the communities inside the court, and using art as an expression of freedom, and also using it as the freedom to express yourself. It's just a most beautiful experience. So that art as a medium to express justice, and in visual form, is sometimes necessary. It is sometimes necessary because it gives people an opportunity to indulge in systems without feeling alienated, without feeling oppressed, without feeling subdued.
The building has so much of resonance about the memory of the past, but also the hope of the future. And I think you beautifully put it about that law is being animated by art rather than the bureaucratic machinery actuarial approach to law. So, I mean, it seems that South Africa is taking major strides in that direction, and I think in many ways this court is pioneering in that it creates that kind of ambiance. Do you see that the impact of that in the work of yourself and your colleagues, that there will be more of that? In other words, that the very idea of law and the very philosophy of law can ultimately be transformed from that very hard-edged, counting numbers, individualistic. Will that help with the Ubuntuification of the legal tradition, but also making it more humane and bringing law back to where it originally was. It was part of the humanistic tradition, etc.
Yeah.
And art is a window into that humanistic tradition.
I think, operating in a space such as the Constitutional Court is totally inspiring. It is totally inspiring. I sometimes tell, when I address communities who come to the court to visit, because I sit as chairperson of the Visitors Committee, I'm always asked to, articulate the role of the court in our democracy and our Constitution and the Bill of Rights to sometimes school children who come to court and members of community, whether they're local communities or whether they're communities from abroad. I always tell them that I find so much inspiration, in the artistic form of the articulating of the values, articulation of South African values in the building itself. When I experience what people generally call writer's block, when I'm writing a judgment, it only takes a walk into the foyer of the Constitutional Court and, standing outside the front door of the Constitutional Court, made of a patchwork of wooden, South African wood, wooden panels of a depiction of the 27 rights in the Bill of Rights. Constantly reminds me what this court is all about. And when I look across, the transparent walls of the Constitutional Court and face right into the buildings of Hillbrow across the Constitutional Court, then I am reminded of what the role of that court is. Where the court sits in a position where it is seen as a bridge between the most oppressed communities in Hillbrow, in Johannesburg, and the business, the CBD, central business district of Braamfontein, where the court is generally seen as a bridge between the two. And I get so much inspiration from that. But then again, if you look at the articulation of the Bill of Rights in the judgments of the Constitutional Court, the articulation of the basis of the idea of equality, where equality in our Constitution is really about rebuilding the dignity of formerly oppressed societies, through the principles and the values of this transformative document. If you look at the way the Constitutional Court articulates the rights in the Constitution, where the impact of the law is central to the idea of justice, and it moves deliberately and consciously away from the bureaucratic, interpretation of the law in the past.
It becomes a theater of law and justice.
Absolutely. It becomes a theater of law and justice where the court performs in free words, the needs and the aspirations of South African society.
On the outside of the building, we have 3 sculptures, and one of them is moving into dance. And we know that you're known as the dancing judge. And I wonder if you can tell us a little bit more about this kind of dancingness of your career, how much you've had to dance, where you've had to dance, and times where you've had to be one who is willing to stand up for the values you're dancing for. So the joyful times in your life and the courageous times in your life. With an eye, now we're shifting to the people who are going to come after you. You're about to step down. People are going to come after you who are both going to have that sense of joy, joie de vivre that you have, and that sense of strength of conviction that you have.
Courage. Yeah. To integrate systems, South Africa moving away from a system of apartheid, where law was simply what the lawmaker said it was, no matter how unjust. And move from that system to a system where the law has to have a just impact on people. It can sometimes be a difficult dance. But then it is a joyful dance when you achieve that translation sometimes perfectly, sometimes imperfectly. But it is a dance. It becomes difficult sometimes, and you can get, joyful results from it. It may be easy, it may be difficult, but it is a dance which you have to dance because you have a role to play as a justice sitting in a court which has the final say in what the law means, in what the impact of those dances will be. And sometimes, with those difficult dances, you come up with an articulation which has to demonstrate the absolute need to move as far away from a previous system as you can. And you will need courage to do that. Because it is not about making popular decisions in the work that the Constitutional Court does. It's not about making popular decisions. Popular in a populist sense of the word. Perhaps popular in the sense that it has to have a just impact on the lives of people. But those are sometimes decisions and articulation that some people don't want to hear. So it is not enough to be a judge with sufficient intellectual capacity to come up with these interpretations and these articulations. You also need the courage of your convictions. May be difficult, but it is sometimes a question of doing what you must do.
In all the artifacts that we talked about now, the dancing, etc., it seems that what your court is talking about is about law as performing and performing through art. and you use the metaphor of dance, and yesterday you used the metaphor of music, the music of the law and the music of justice, etc. It seems that it creates a whole different sensibility that law is just not something that is handed down, but is something that manifests itself in bodies and souls, right? As it ought to be. Yeah. You speak 7 languages, and you also try to make the law legible. I mean that, and you use the word translation. How would you say, if when you look back at your career, 1 or 2 things that you had made the law legible in the way that you can say, I would like to be remembered for that?
You remind me of a question that one student during our, interactions with students, one student asked me, if you operate as a collective court as you do, how do you make a name for yourself? And the student had to understand, when you operate as a judge of the Constitutional Court, you are not there to make a name for yourself. You are there to serve in the articulation of the creation of a just democratic society. And there are a number of ways in which you do that. Other than articulate the rights that are protected in the Constitution through your judgments, I've always found it very important to serve as a justice beyond the confines of the 4 walls of the Constitutional Court. And I believe that continuous interaction between those who understand and have the strength to articulate the justice which operates, the levels of justice which operates in our society, to demystify that among communities. And I do it all the time. I'm fortunate in the sense that when I was appointed to the Constitutional Court, I was a professor of law. And I've always believed in demystifying the law for ordinary people. And those are some of the projects that I, did when I was a professor of law, and I've never stopped to do that. That I'm sitting as chairperson of the Visitors Committee of the Constitutional Court is probably not by accident. I think that's how my colleagues see me. And they sometimes see me as the face, the public face of the Constitutional Court. And because I love that role, that is the role that I generally play outside of my functions as a justice, dealing with the articulation of the judicial system and the justice and the Constitution in our judgments. And I would like to be remembered as that.
So, in our concluding section, would you like to ask the first question?
No, please go ahead.
We'd like to hear something about what the future holds for you, Justice Mokgoro, Yvonne, and maybe you can, at that point, explain something about Cape Coast and Ghana, Ghanaian dance, all of the things that you will be taking on in your new role after you've built up this institution so painstakingly for the last 15 years. What's the next act in this performance?
I think we should see it as after I have made a contribution in building this institution, because I certainly do not see myself as responsible for the building of that institution. But as I said earlier, when I was appointed to the Constitutional Court, I was a professor of law, and I loved every bit of it. And when I stepped down as a justice of the Constitutional Court, where you serve for 15 years, and my 15 years have come, to an end. It will come to an end in October of this year. I am simply going back to teaching the law. And I think the experience that I have gained at the Constitutional Court will stand me in really good stead, in taking forward the project of the idea of a democracy in South Africa based on justice. And the experiences that I had at the Constitutional Court are experiences that I want to share with South Africans particularly, but generally with the people of the world, because I see myself as a member of the society of the world. And throughout my 15-year operation at the court, I have continued to serve as an academic, because I've taught at various universities outside of South Africa. I have a particular, I feel a particular obligation towards the African continent. And I want to continue to serve, in the promotion of justice and democracy on the continent wherever I can. And I had a very important visit to Ghana not so recently. We were invited by the Chief Justice of Ghana to participate in what they call the Legal Year, which is a celebration of the beginning of the operation of the term of the Ghanaian judiciary. And we were invited as South Africans, and I was invited as a judge from South Africa to participate in that program. And I had connected so strongly with my Ghanaian counterparts, and was requested to participate in the setting up of a new law school at Cape Coast University. And I think I'm excited by the idea that I will be able, once I step down from the court, to participate in the understanding of the law, as part of enhancing the idea of justice and democracy in the continent as a whole, South Africa being part of the continent, and I seeing myself as part of the African continent. And I'm quite excited by the idea that I will not be able only continue to be an advocate of justice and democracy in South Africa, in the world generally as I do, but particularly on the African continent. And to be able to play that role, I think I cherish that.
Justice Mokgoro, and up to this point of your life, which you've had such a rich experience of life in Galeshiwe, and then moving to the highest court in South Africa through academia, etc. If there's one or two lessons that you would want to share that might be of value to students or viewers of this program, etc., what would that parting counsel, that advice be for such an audience?
You know, my dad always used to say to us, whatever you do it well. Whatever you do. Even if your role or your job is to sweep the streets of your city, sweep them well. Make sure that when you look back and you look at the contributions that you have made, it is contributions that you can be proud of. So whatever you do it really well. It might sound as a cliche, but in life, because you are a human being with the human spirit and the human strength, the sky is the limit. If you have opportunities, first of all, strengthen yourself to recognize opportunities. And when you recognize them, make use of them. And when you make use of them, do it well. You must, of course, have ambition. But take the opportunities to live out your ambitions. And an integral part of the idea of living out your ambitions is to make sure that you become not only integral to the development of your society, make sure that you play a role in advancing the development of your society. So you must, in simple words, become a useful member of society. And if you operate in a society where the sky is the limit, you will reach the sky.
Well, it's a very sad thing, but we have only so much time with you here at this residency that you've graced us with, and we would like to thank you not only for this interview, Yvonne, but we would like to thank you for the time and the heart and soul that you've brought to Duke University, and we hope that this interview will give some sense of that, but we want you to know that your contributions to us have definitely expanded our skies. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for making me part of this community for the past 2 weeks. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.